Last week, I found myself at the crossroads of familial loyalty and gut instinct, torn apart by my father's health issues and the shadow that loomed over his friend Walter, a man who'd slithered into our lives with charm and an unsettling undertone. My father, once vibrant and full of life, had been grappling with aggressive cancer for the past year, and despite the slowly thickening fog of despair that shrouded our home, Walter had introduced himself as a source of comfort under the guise of a devoted ally. I didn't think much of it at first. He showed up with handfuls of flowers, extravagant presents, and what seemed like genuine concern for my father's well-being. Every week, he called to check in, send uplifting messages, and even accompanied my dad to the very first round of treatments. But it wasn't long before I began noticing the little things, the way Walter would linger too long on the fringes of conversations, the crinkle in his smile whenever Dad mentioned me or my accomplishments, a creeping envy that spewed from his otherwise polished demeanor. The essence of his being wrapped itself around my father like an invasive vine, smothering his spirit while nurturing the insatiable thirst for control that lurked behind Walter's friendly facade. So when I found out that Walter had made plans to accompany my dad to his crucial 6-month checkup, a kind of distorted appointment that could either bring a glimmer of hope or the plunge into eternal darkness, my heart clenched tightly in rebellion. I dreaded the idea of relinquishing my protective post, of handing over my father's fragile trust to this man who felt more like a predator than a friend. I consulted my mother, who had been distant and quiet since Dad's diagnosis, and her silence spoke volumes. It was a low-grade anxiety that bubbled just under the surface, a synchronous heartbeat with my own buried fears. That night, I caved into the entangling dread and called the office, leaving a message, insisting that only I would accompany Dad to his appointment. The relief coursing through my veins was short-lived. When the day finally came, I met Walter standing at the front door, a smug smile plastered across his face, as if he had anticipated my next move. My father, clad in one of his favorite flannel shirts, looked caught between confusion and disappointment, but I latched onto his gaze, conveying a silent message that shattered my heart but bolstered my conviction. "Dad," I said, my voice shaking slightly as I stepped forwards, "I think it's best if I come with you today." Walter scoffed, retorting too quickly, "Oh come on, it's just a checkup. You don't need to coddle him like this." Each syllable felt like barbed wire wrapped around the words, tugging at something primal and repulsive inside me. A scream clawed at the back of my throat, fought tooth and nail against the savagery consuming my rationality. "This isn't just a checkup," I shot back defensively. "It's one of the most significant days he'll have in months. You don't need to be there. You're not his family." My father blinked, a flicker of recognition in his eyes, but Walter's reaction was sinister in nature. It turned from shock to thin-lipped anger, a quiet promise of retribution hidden beneath tightly wound lips. The tension crackled in the air like pre-storm electricity, and suddenly, I felt as if every single unwelcome thought I'd buried deep beneath the surface burrowed its way back into prominence, revealing the possibility that Walter could very well be a wolf in sheep's clothing, his concerns surprisingly coordinated with plans I couldn't even fathom. "Fine," Walter said, a smile creeping back onto his face like a spider waiting for its chance to snag its prey, "but you'll see, my support was what he needed after all." As my father slipped on his coat and I ushered him forward, I dared not glance back at Walter, but a cold chill washed over me, an irrational fear gnawing at my insides like rats feasting on the carcass of my worst nightmares. The ride to the hospital was a silent war zone. I searched for the right words to calm my racing heart. My dad nodded, oblivious to my internal struggle, as I feigned casual conversation about the upcoming baseball season, drowning every overture of worry beneath a thin ocean of pleasantries. When we finally arrived, the walls around us seemed to close in with every passing moment, and as we stepped into the sterile waiting room, I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that Walter was lurking just beyond the proximity of that polished glass entrance. Hours passed slowly, dragging our spirits into the unforgiving jaws of uncertainty, each tick of the clock as menacing as the last. When my father was finally called in for his examination, I was asked to wait, and though I tried to maintain an air of nonchalance, my heart thudded painfully, each beat a reminder of everything I feared. And then, without warning, there he was, Walter, striding into the waiting area, face plastered with a sinister blend of smugness and feigned concern. "Good news, huh?" he chirped, as if the world shrank around us to conform to his twisted whims. "I'll be here for my dear friend no matter what." My stomach churned, wrestling the truth that clawed at me. "Walter, you shouldn't be here," I stammered, a fight tangled within me against the absurdity of the interview. "Why do you keep coming around? The look that fell across Walter's face was something indescribably dark as he stepped closer. Because someone has to ensure he receives the care he deserves. It would be a shame if something happened to him, by virtue of not having the right people around. The nuance painted in his words dripped with malevolence, the air locked in a state of compression as realization dawned on me. I leapt back, a chill overtaking my skin. You've been sending anonymous messages, haven't you? You've been trying to manipulate him. My accusations hung in the air, feeble but resonating with the truth crashing against my consciousness. Without uttering a word, he leaned closer, and I felt the walls closing in. It was as if my head spun, revelations crashing like glass against stone, the fraying thread of trust unraveling before my very eyes. I fled from him, desperate to reach my father's side, my heart racing, echoing the silent screams spinning in my mind. But by the time I pushed past the nurses to enter the examination room, the words I'd rehearsed had turned to dust on my tongue. My father lay back, a weary smile plastered on his face, and I caught the flicker of confusion in his eyes as he met my gaze. My heart sank. He didn't see the monster lurking just beyond the hospital walls. Instead, it was me, a pariah in the realm of protectiveness. I rushed towards him, wanting nothing more than to mount a defense against the darkness crawling into our lives. Dad, you need to. Just as I began to explain, Walter sauntered into the room, seamlessly sliding into the space like he owned it. You can't live in fear anymore. You have me, I'm your friend and I'm here, he insisted, his tone deceptively calm yet devoid of sincerity. My father blinked, twitching uneasily beneath the pressure of conflicting loyalties, and it felt like hours between breaths. The doctor interrupted us, and relief coiled around my heart like a snake, only for dread to nearly engulf me whole when I left the room to glimpse Walter alone with my father, whispering sweet poison that danced dangerously on the edge of tainted truth. I wrestled with the idea that I needed to pull my father from Walter's grasp. His web was spun tighter than I fathomed. I caught a glimpse of their post-reaction through the frosted glass of the door, Walter's hand resting too nonchalantly atop my father's shoulder. My chest tightened, adrenaline flooding my system, my scream almost escaping my lips when the distant conversation morphed into a grotesque display of betrayal. I burst through the doorway, and as the words tumbled from my mouth, a cacophony of emotions spiraled around me. Leave him alone, I yelled, every ounce of fear pouring into those words. Walter turned, eyes laced with surprise. She's just upset because she knows we're getting closer, he chirped casually, yet the menace dripping from that statement sent goosebumps racing along my skin. My father's expression, perplexed and vulnerable, tugged at my core as he looked between Walter and me. In that instant, I understood the depth of Walter's deception, the slowly curling tendrils of malice wound around my father's already fragile spirit. You don't need him, Dad. You have me. We'll do this together, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, the weight of my realization crashing down on me in waves that threatened to encase us both. The doctor stepped in just then, canceling out the tension, and I caught Walter's eyes flicker to something behind me. I turned, electrified, a specter of dread washed over me as I realized he had a plan, something sinister orchestrated within the walls of this sterile fortress. After the appointment concluded, I insisted on finding a new oncologist, my father's indifference echoing hollow against the rising tide of my anguish. It was then that I began hearing whisperings through the townsfolk and family friends, small hints painted over Walter's troubled past, a tapestry entwined with quiet malevolence and ghost stories that left me unsettled. Nightmares haunted my sleep, each encounter with Walter grew more distorted, wrapping itself around my psyche. I couldn't let him invade our lives any longer, but how could I convince my father of the truth? Eventually, my father grew weaker, the cancer took its toll, and all the while Walter gathered around like a vulture, determined to feed off the fragments of my family. One night, after a fraught dinner where Walter's charm barely masked his undertones, I knew I had to expose him, unveil the monster for who he truly was. I called my father to the living room. By now he was frail and pale, and I could see the shadows that tag-teamed with Walter's presence. It felt as though the very air shimmered with an unreadable tension. Dad, I began slowly, we need to talk about Walter. I want to share what I discovered. The moment I uttered his name, the familiar gleam of disapproval glimmered in my father's eyes, and I could see Walter's shadows stretching across the room like dark wings, encircling me in his grasp. Don't listen to her, old friend, Walter interjected smoothly, she's just scared of losing you. We all know she tends to exaggerate, don't we? But my father shook his head, tired but urgent. I could feel his heart battling against the manipulation lurking behind Walter's facade. You need to understand, he's not what you think he is. He's been lying to you about his intentions. The room stilled, and in that breathless silence, my mind raced. He's been sending anonymous letters to make it seem like you're worse off than you are. He's trying to take control of the decisions and manipulate you, Walter chuckled, feigning a mockery of restraint. Sweetheart, isn't it sad how desperately she clings to this idea to keep herself relevant? But my father narrowed his eyes, a fleeting clarity washing over him. Yet in the wreckage of dissected truth, chaos erupted, and Walter's visage morphed into a furious beast as he lunged towards me, venom dripping from his smile. You ungrateful little rat. After everything I've done for you, you dare defile my name? The vulnerability I clung onto began crumbling, and my heart raced as I dove towards my father's side with a growl that reverberated through the walls of our home. This was a battle for survival, a last fight to ensure he wouldn't succumb to the poison oozing from Walter. Dad, please, you need to believe me, I cried desperately, as Walter's towering presence threatened to engulf us both. I realized then that Walter's grip had taken a form we hadn't yet acknowledged, a resonance of death that fed upon our house like a cancer of its own, and with a flicker of realization, I could feel the shadows pulling at my father's breath, tightening beyond relief. I composed myself, lending everything my heart had against the suffocating wall of Walter, and declared, if you love him, you'll let him go. Walter's laughter lingered, a cacophony that seemed to bounce off the walls before a sudden silence erupted, and I watched in horror as my father hesitated, a flicker of recognition lighting his eyes. The horror spiraled as I made the realization that his only allies were the ghosts of Walter's manipulation, wielding the tenacity of a predator ready to feast. But I refused to back down. I had so much more to say. I needed him to grasp the truth, and it screamed louder than Walter's veiled threats. A moment of poise fell, and when Walter clenched his jaw, I knew that I didn't just seek to save myself but to out anyone who stood even in the periphery of my father's existence. You may think that you're infallible, but the weight of your lies will bury you. My heart felt like it was shattering, the final pleads vibrating within my own empathy as the walls held their breath, and somewhere deep inside, I felt shivers slither across the threshold. I waited, holding the air, straining for a crack in Walter's facade, searching for the slightest glimpse of vulnerability. Enough, Walter roared, collapsing into a distorted semblance of rage, his mask peeling away. You think you can just take him away? He's mine. I thought you had a stronger bond with him. This is how it has always been. With a growing intensity, the air thrummed, the rage pulsed within the room, and as Walter's frustration peaked, it felt like a storm encroaching upon us. If I could just hold on to my father, a newfound strength carving a connection between us, perhaps we could find redemption. The distance and estrangement cloaked the air, but fury ferreted out the truth hidden within. I stepped forward once more, offering my hand to my father, anchoring him against Walter's maelstrom. Let's leave together, I said softly, my heart desperate against the agony of losing the pivotal relationship to a monster who had no right to claim him. At that moment, an eerie stillness descended, and I witnessed the shifting shadows around us, the fatigue that racked my father's frail body battling against the tendrils snaking from Walter's malevolent smile. You can't save him from the truth, Walter whispered, he will always be with me. No more. I thought fiercely, feeling a tide of my voice igniting the calm spaces surrounding us. No, we can build a future together. The ugly truth revealed as we stepped outside, leaving behind a fragment of itself while welcoming ourselves into the light of new beginnings, the future flickering before us, painstaking yet full of promise. But the last whispers of Walter's proposition wouldn't simply vanish, they lingered behind us like shadows demanding acknowledgement. Weeks passed, during which our home transformed, dwindling specters fading out and acceptance pulling us back into the warmth of family. The truth clocks in, pieces falling into place, as I began helping Dad in ways I feared to lose. But bursts of fear often struck at night. Even though Walter's grip had lessened, the remembrance of what bruised betrayal could do festered as an unease spinning in cycles. It wasn't until one dark, moonless night when nightmares draped themselves around my father and rushed towards the door, a frantic rap echoing against the rich silence. Reading the moment, I approached the door cautiously, the fury of nervous energy surging beneath my skin as the wood groaned beneath my grip. Who could it be? I hesitated, remembering all too clearly the edges that Walter put upon our existence. When I finally opened it, the chill in the air carried the sharp scent of fear. My father blinked, utterly confused, forged in the alleys of worry, and now burdened further by uncertainty. It's him, isn't it? I murmured, my heartbeat harmonizing with the echoes surrounding me. He's coming back for us. The trepidation clouded his expression, and as doubt etched itself deep within my father's brow, I could feel the shadows once more. It felt like the beginning swirling beneath the surface, remnants of a battle unearthed. You're not going back there, I breathed firmly, feeling the weight of resolution solidifying around us as the seconds dwindled into eternity. Yet Walter wasn't finished. I could feel those eyes probing our defenses, waiting to reclaim the fragments he sought, to wrap them once more within the binding tales of betrayal and tendrils with which he'd strangled our past. A decision rested firmly between us. I steeled my resolve against every ounce of anxiety, fitfully battling against the shadows that might lie ahead. I had freed us once, and I wouldn't surrender with the chains of fear tethered once more. As the door creaked behind me, I knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a stronger bond forged beneath harrowing trials and solidified through every grain of untold sacrifice. I had to convince my father that vulnerability was the foundation of our freedom, that the shadows could only do harm if we allowed them entry. Together, we would endure, for the truth of family burned brighter than the cold encroaching darkness, one which I refused to let win its relentless battle over us. And in that commitment, I felt the darkness encroach upon us, twist into unseen dimensions. Even if Walter tried re-entering our space, I would not let him reclaim the love that remained. I fought for every shred of hope, for every moment that manifested genuine bonds forged through solemnity, warmed by genuine love. It was in that resolve that we pushed back against the darkness, into the light of possibility, the kind that promised liberation from chains that could never be fastened against family, of a future beyond the haunting whispers of Walter's name, long faded yet wordlessly existing, intertwining real ties and those infernal shadows hovering just outside our reach. I'm not sure how to start this without sounding melodramatic, but I need to share this before it eats me alive. My friend Danny, who, like me, is 23 years old, had been pestering me to set him up with my best friend, Laura, for months. She's beautiful, smart, and genuinely one of the best people I know. We had been friends since childhood, and after a slew of terrible dates, I thought, why not? On paper, they seemed like a match made in heaven. Both love horror movies, the same music, and they both had quirky senses of humor. But every time I tried to broker this budding romance, something fell through. He would flirt with her one moment and then completely ghost her the next, and I could see how it hurt Laura when he'd vanish as if she were nothing. Finally, I confronted Danny about it. What's your deal? If you want to date her, then do it. Don't just toy with her feelings, I told him one night as we shared drinks. He shrugged it off, saying he was just busy. I didn't buy it, but I let it go, until the day they finally met up, a Friday night that still haunts me. When I got the call from Laura the next morning, I could hardly believe what I was hearing. He stood me up, and he didn't even text me to say he wouldn't come, she choked out between sobs, and as she recounted her harrowing experience waiting in that stupid cafe with her heart in her throat, I felt rage boil within me. Danny had let her wait for 2 hours before sending a text that something came up, which is code for, I couldn't care less about you. I spent the rest of the weekend comforting Laura, who couldn't understand what had gone wrong. She deserved better, and all I could think of was Danny's selfishness. The following week, I told Danny I was done helping him. AITA for refusing to set up my friend anymore after he stood up my best friend? I asked him directly, hoping for some sign of remorse, but he shrugged it off as if it didn't matter. He laughed, a hollow sound that seemed to echo in the confines of my mind, and that's when I noticed it, the change in him, something darker lurking beneath the surface. I thought it was just disappointment at being denied a date, but then things started getting weird. A few days later, Laura and I found a note on her car windshield, scrawled in handwriting I didn't recognize, reading, "You should find someone who actually wants you," and it sent chills down my spine. I dismissed it as some random jerk, but then she began receiving messages on social media from a profile with no followers or posts. The person behind it clearly knew things about her that they shouldn't have, places she frequented and inside jokes we had shared. Each time I texted Danny, he ignored me or gave flippant responses that made my stomach twist. "My bad," he'd write back. "I've been busy." I had started keeping track of the odd notes and the increasingly menacing messages Laura was receiving. They grew more and more detailed, leaning closer toward stalking. I began to wonder if it was all a sick game played by Danny to get back at Laura for humiliating him by uncovering his true nature. But I didn't confront him again, fearing what might happen if I pushed. I was convinced he was somehow involved. They were intertwined in a twisted fate that I could no longer untangle. On a freezing December evening, Laura and I went out to grab some groceries, both feeling the weight of the ominous recent events. She pulled out her phone and went pale. There it was again, a message waiting for her: "You should really stay home tonight." The lights flickered above us as a sickening chill washed over me, and I could swear that a shadow crossed over the grocery store. Moments later, Laura and I split up to grab the last few items on our list, and when I turned down the cereal aisle, I noticed a figure at the far end. His back was turned to me, but his posture was all too familiar. Panic surged through me. Danny had been sneaking around while I wasn't paying attention. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned slightly, just enough for me to glimpse his face, and I felt my heart drop. It wasn't Danny at all, but someone who looked alarmingly similar, a glint of madness in his eyes. I froze, the grocery list slipping from my hands. Before I could move, he took a single step toward me, and in that moment, the lights went out. All I could hear was the sound of frantic breathing and an overwhelming sense of dread. I bolted, screaming for Laura as I raced through the store, grabbing at the edges of my sanity. I found her in the aisle, her face ghostly pale, and she was gripping her phone tightly, shaking. "Did you see him?" she whispered, and I nodded, still reeling from the terror of being so close to something I couldn't explain. In the following days, I made the hard choice to go to the police, warily explaining the situation. They brushed it off, saying it could be a prank, but something in my gut told me otherwise. Then, without warning, Laura disappeared. One minute she was there, and then she was gone, spilling laughter and warmth into the world, and the next, it was like she had never existed. My heart ached, frantically searching for signs of her in her usual hangouts, social media, anything, and every night I returned to my darkened apartment, guilt gnawing at my mind like the predator it had become. I finally reached out to Danny one last time, hoping against hope that he would tell me where she was, but all I got was a deadpan "You should have stayed out of it." It was a message so straightforward it cut through me, and desperation consumed me as I tried tracing back everything that had happened. It finally hit me: every dark turn we took led back to him. I couldn't let it go, and so, the next Thursday, I found myself standing outside his apartment, too many unanswered questions pulling me toward confrontation. I knocked on the door. I didn't care if I appeared insane. The door creaked open, revealing him, a sly grin stretching across his face. "Thought you might come," he said, stepping aside to let me in, as if he planned this all along. When I stepped inside, the stench hit me like a freight train. "What's wrong with you?" I managed, feeling sick. There were notes scattered everywhere, torn photographs plastered on walls, the evidence of his obsession. I saw Laura's face among them, eyes wide in terror, and it felt like my entire world collapsed. He turned to me, eyes gleaming. "She made me do this. If you had just let me have her, none of this would have happened." I staggered backward in horror as he reached for something behind him. Was it a knife? But I dipped sideways, ducking and sprinting for the door. I burst outside, adrenaline propelling me forward, and just as I neared the stairs, I heard him call after me, a low chuckle echoing through the hallway. "See you soon." I never found Laura. The police still refused to believe me. Danny is still out there, lurking, with secrets that threaten to break through the cracks of reality. As for me, I live in fear every day that he'll find me, too, because I know what he did, and he's not done yet. So, AITA for refusing to set my friend up ever again? I guess I'll never know, as I am too afraid of what darkness lies within the heart of those you think you know. The truth is, I simply can't afford to find out. I never thought that allowing my mother to host Thanksgiving dinner at my house would lead to such chaos, but here we are, 3 days away from the holiday, and all I can think about is how I may have opened the door to something unspeakable. My wife, Sarah, is heavily pregnant with our 4th child and has been feeling exhausted and anxious, so I thought it would be a kind gesture to let my mother take over the cooking this year. She's been insisting on bringing her classic turkey and stuffing for as long as I can remember, and although my mother is eccentric, let's just say her ideas about food are unique, she promised she wouldn't do anything too outlandish this time. Since our first Thanksgiving together as a married couple, I've always felt the pressure of blending our families in the presence of holiday cheer, and Sarah has been under so much stress already. But as the day approaches, I've started to notice things that make my skin crawl. It began when my mother presented a package of what she claimed were secret spices for the turkey, each ingredient labeled with cryptic names. She explained they were traditional family recipes passed down for generations, but there was something eerie about the way her eyes sparkled when she mentioned them, like a wolf revealing its meal after a successful hunt. Sarah, noticing my discomfort, told me to ease up and let my mom have her fun, but late at night, when it was just the three of us and the kids were asleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I could hear my mother moving around the kitchen, testing her concoctions and humming strange lullabies that felt foreign, even menacing, in their melody. The scent of the spices wafting into the living room was strangely intoxicating, laced with an undertone that made me feel both dizzy and anxious, and every time I tried to confront her, she dismissed my concerns with a wave of her hand, claiming it was all in good spirit and for the family. It was around this same time that I found our youngest, Emma, talking to what she described as an invisible friend who made her giggle loudly at odd moments. Kids her age often have imaginary friends, but when I pried deeper, Emma's stories took on a bizarre, unsettling tone. "He says Grandma's food is magic and that we're all invited to dinner," she'd say, her eyes wide with a mix of excitement and trepidation, as if she were caught between a dream and a nightmare. As Thanksgiving Day neared, my anxiety spiraled, and it didn't help that Sarah was increasingly sleepy and withdrawn, unable to shake what she described as a lingering fog in her mind. It was then that I went to look for my mother, only to find her hunched over the kitchen table, her fingers dripping with purple-red juices that I didn't want to think too hard about. "I'm just preparing the turkey, sweetie, don't worry," she said with an unsettling grin that stretched across her face, revealing crooked teeth that seemed to glisten with something unholy. I saw a glimpse of the turkey. Its skin was unnaturally glossy, and there were an array of small, round wounds where the feathers had once lain, looking almost like a string of pearls encased in the fleshy, glistening skin. "Where did you get this?" I uttered, trying to keep my throat from constricting too tightly. My mother looked back at me, her expression shifting from affectionate to something feral, and though she didn't answer, the air in the room thickened with a kind of infectious dread. I stumbled backward, grappling with the chill creeping up my spine, convinced my mother was losing her mind. Before I could leave, she whispered, "They'll love it, they were waiting for you," and my heart raced painfully at the insinuation. It was without question a breaking point. I confronted Sarah, suggesting we uninvite my mother, but her response left me stunned. "Let her do this, please. I think I need it. I don't want to deal with anything else right now." I pestered her for weeks, but with that hint of desperation in her voice, I felt backed into a corner. Thanksgiving came, and the atmosphere was rife with tension. I attempted to remain composed as friends and family arrived, but a discomforting strain hung over us, a dark cloud shrouding the festivities. The food, glistening in all its macabre beauty, began to arrive, turkey adorned with crimson glimmers, sides overflowing with vibrant colors, the very air filled with an intoxicating sweetness that made my head spin. As we sat at the table, I eyed the kids, who eagerly hovered over the food, whispering secrets amongst one another, fueled by some silent pact I couldn't grasp. I watched in horror as they took their first bites, followed by delightful gasps and soft giggles, every forkful seeming to ignite their spirits to heights I'd never seen before, yet there was an edge of something primal in their delight. The adults, too, were transfixed, chatting joyfully as if no one else could sense the creeping chill between us, the hallucinations in the corners of visions that twisted laughter into darker sounds. My chest tightened as I felt my mother's gnarled fingers brush against my shoulder, and she leaned in to whisper, "They told me this day would come, that all would be well. Don't you see, this is how we keep the magic alive?" I felt ice coil around my heart, the ominous weight of her words settling deep within me. The moment Emma leaned across the table, her smile too wide, too predatory, to announce that Grandma's magic tastes so good. And my body began to betray me, the urge to scream battling against my instinct to protect. And then, just as quickly, I felt my resolve waver, almost collapsing under the deliciously dark enchantment that twisted through the air like invisible threads binding us all. That evening blurred between reality and terror, all of us trapped in a dreamscape where joy danced alongside malevolence. I realized with a jolt that the children were not simply enjoying a Thanksgiving feast, something dangerous was unfolding. Before I could act, the lights flickered, plunging us into shadows, and as confusion reigned, Sarah's voice echoed through the darkness, "We're all just pieces in her game," tinged with an eerie, knowing calmness, as if she were in on a secret knowing I could not comprehend. At that moment, I felt an exhilarating thrill of the macabre awakening deep inside, tearing at the ties of sanity as I become a spectator in this grotesque festival, watching my family become enraptured, my mother's soft laughter raking through the cracks of normality, as they surrendered to a feast that was anything but ordinary. I could hear a soft chant rise from the children, their words swirling like whispers carried on the wind, and that night, as darkness settled, I understood that I had failed my family. What I had thought to be a simple holiday dinner had turned into a horrifying rite, where every bite tightened the grip of something lurking, hungry, at the edges of my world, drawn in by a maternal force that would stop at nothing to ensure that this Thanksgiving would never end. When my cousin Morgan invited me to her graduation party, I was excited but also apprehensive. She had always been the golden child, and I never really measured up. So when I discovered through a mutual friend that she'd actually paid her way through an online diploma mill, a secret she vehemently tried to keep under wraps, I felt compelled to confront her in a way I never had before. As I arrived at the lavishly decorated backyard where Instagram-ready balloons floated like pastel clouds and a makeshift wooden stage awaited the valedictorian speech, I saw Morgan basking in the glow of attention, glamorous in her cap and gown, but something about her smile felt rehearsed, a facade that cracked when I caught her in a whispered conversation with her mother, her eyes betraying a flicker of vulnerability, a hint of the dread that shadowed her achievement. The tension spiraled as I witnessed her proudly accepting faux accolades from family members who knew nothing about the truth, their hearts too eager to embrace the lie she had spun, and despite my reservations, I found myself standing closer than I should have, caught in a tide of bitter resentment and the sinking realization that the very fabric of our familial love was woven by deception. When the moment arrived, and the spotlight danced its way to me, I felt a surge of jealousy threaten to overthrow my sanity as I grasped the microphone, and almost involuntarily, I blurted out, "Congratulations, Morgan. But I guess it's not my fault you bought your degree." The gasps were audible, a sharp intake of air that split the warm afternoon like thunder, and Morgan's expression shifted instantly from shock to rage, the kind that transformed her cherubic face into a monstrous reflection of pure betrayal. Struggling to maintain my composure under the onslaught of disdainful glares from shocked relatives, I felt a rush of adrenaline, knowing I had thrown a match into a sea of dry kindling. It was a chaotic flurry of shouting voices and clattering utensils, her mother gasping as if I had slapped her across the face. Morgan lunged at me, fists flying, but I didn't back down. My voice echoed like a battle cry as I shouted back about the years spent on her high horse while I worked hard for every scrap of recognition I ever got. The guests' faces were a grim collage of disappointment and concern as Morgan choked back tears and accused me of ruining her day, insisting that our family's blood and humor had always been worth celebrating, but I stood firm in my accusation, questioning the very essence of her achievement, a hyena's laugh punctuating the tension as I pointed to her stack of ceremony photos where every smile seemed to mock the truth, and in that moment, her mask slipped away entirely, revealing the dread underneath. The argument devolved into an exhibition of dirty laundry dragged through the sunshine, where her past transgressions and insecurities collided with my burdens, creating an intangible fissure between us that I feared could never be mended, all eyes piercing through me with an intensity I had never felt before, until suddenly, an older relative stepped in, an uncle I hadn't spoken to in years, who claimed to know everything, or at least our family folklore, and in that uncanny silence that followed his boisterous entry, I realized I wasn't alone in feeling weighed down by each lie we had ever entertained. It seemed there were whispers buried beneath the layers of our gatherings, and somehow I had exposed an unseen reality that shook the very roots of our idyllic narratives, and as the evening devolved into something grotesque, I felt the atmosphere shift as Morgan's confidence withered, beaten down by the harsh glare of scrutiny while our relatives circled her like vultures, waiting for her to admit her mistake amidst the chaos I had ignited. Days melted into nights, turning that party into a cursed memory, an echo reverberating in my mind where guilt twisted with vindication. I became the antagonist in my family's story, labeled as the villain who dared to expose the truth in the face of a flawless facade, while Morgan slipped deeper into denial, swaddled by the lies she had built her life upon until her phone began buzzing like a hornet's nest. Yet the only messages I received were warnings from friends out of fear of family repercussions for having spoken my mind. A week later, I awoke to a world shimmering with silence. The calls from my family had ceased, the chatter turned hollow, and every gathering near my doorstep became a reminder of the rift I had created, until Morgan's mother called me with that threatening tone, implying that I had pulled the curtain on a family scandal too sinister to ignore and told me that if I valued our relationship at all, I would confess and apologize, but I staunchly held my ground, knowing deep down our world was riddled with secrets worth preserving. But as tension morphed into shadows, something shifted in the air. Whispers followed me through the streets as eye contact became a dangerous commodity among family, where every encounter felt like a trial for my transgressions. And one particularly lonely night, as I sat on my porch nursing regrets, Morgan appeared without warning, her eyes clouded with uncertainty but her resolve sparked like wildfire. The once inseparable bond now lay ruptured, festering wounds of jealousy and betrayal threatening to drown any flicker of hope. She confessed that she had lived in fear, unable to tell anyone the truth about how she felt trapped in the mirage of success she had crafted, the facade becoming a noose as constricting as the expectations her mother thrust upon her. I watched her as she broke down, everything she personified crumbling into a cascade of tears. I thought this vulnerability might grant us the catharsis needed, but instead, the revelation left a bitter taste that thickened the already toxic atmosphere. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere thickened with dread, but I could not shake the feeling that I had unleashed something dark and vast into our lives. But it wasn't until Morgan threatened to seek her truth among strangers and let the world see what lay beneath our collective skin, that I understood how fragile our positions were. Each word we exchanged now felt like blades sharp enough to cleave the very fabric of our belonging, and I wondered if I had become the architect of my own isolation, torn between the vindication of honesty and the warmth of denial that had wrapped us like a cocoon for too long. When the day finally dawned, bright yet oppressive, I found myself spiraling, the daylight harsh against my regret as Morgan prepared to reveal all on social media. My heart pounded like a war drum, my vision tunneled in on the inevitable pain, but when she finally pressed send, I was left gasping in shock as the floodgates opened. Those who had smiled at her celebration turned into virtual haters, cloaked in anonymity yet wielding their venom like knives as they punctured her facade, leaving Morgan in the ruins of her own making, shattered pieces drifting away as their words became anchors that dragged her deeper into despair. In the aftermath, as relatives distanced themselves and the truth morphed into its own gelatinous monster, I wondered whether I had been right all along or merely too cowardly to save us from the inevitable. And as Morgan sat in a self-constructed prison of hate and sorrow, I learned through the lens of my own brokenness that sometimes, saying the hard truth reveals scars too deep to heal, leaving behind a silence that echoes louder than any shout of victory could ever hope to drown. I was never the kind of person who took pleasure in stirring the pot, but the strange events that unfolded on my parents' land last autumn left me questioning everything I thought I knew about our little corner of the world, and myself. You see, every morning, I'd take my dog, Max, for a stroll along the well-trodden paths through the woods behind our house, an area usually filled with the comforting sounds of rustling leaves and distant bird calls, but October was different. The chill in the air held an edge, and the atmosphere turned thick with tension. Hunting season had begun, and with it came whispers of unease among the townsfolk. My parents warned me to steer clear of the usual hunting spots, but to be honest, I thought they were overreacting. After all, this was our family land, and what right did a couple of hunters have to dictate where I could walk my dog? 2 weeks into October, as orange leaves fluttered down like nature's confetti, I decided to ignore my parents' cautious advice. It was a crisp Saturday morning when I leashed up Max and headed out towards the back trails. I felt empowered, determined to reclaim my daily ritual, but as we strolled deeper into the woods, a creeping sensation clawed at my spine. Maybe it was just unease from my parents' warnings, maybe it was simple instinct, but something felt off. The woods suddenly seemed alive with unspoken secrets. My heart raced as we rounded a bend in the path and I noticed a tree stand, a crude wooden platform nestled high among the branches of an ancient oak, unmoving but for the sway of the tree. Something made me hesitate as I scanned the area, watching. An irrational part of me considered turning back, but then I saw him, a figure clad in camo, sitting stoically within the confines of the stand, a hunting rifle resting against his knee. He didn't seem to notice us at first, but as I pulled Max closer, I caught a glimpse of what lay beneath that camouflage. His eyes, cold and calculating, focused sharply on me. My skin prickled as the tension in the air intensified, and Max whimpered beside me, ever the sensitive companion. I made the snap decision to keep walking, hoping that if I ignored him, he would do the same. I felt foolish, but it was just a tree stand and a hunter. I had every right to be there. Yet, no sooner had we strolled past the tree than a sharp snap echoed through the quiet woods, like a twig being crushed underfoot. My heart dropped into my stomach. I turned to see the hunter had shifted slightly, almost as if he were adjusting his grip on the rifle, but something felt incredibly wrong. There was a predatory quality to his calm demeanor, a languid patience, like a lion sizing up an unsuspecting gazelle. I picked up the pace, clenching the leash tighter as a wave of primal fear washed over me. Max trotted beside me, seemingly sensing the change in energy, his tail low and his ears alert. I didn't dare look back. I was on my parents' land, I reminded myself again and again, but it was no longer comforting. The sensation of being hunted kept gnawing at my thoughts, and dread mingled with the crisp autumn air as every snap of a twig sent my pulse racing. Just before we reached the clearing, a voice called out, gravelly and low, shattering the suffocating silence and sending a jolt through my body. "Hey! You shouldn't be here." It was the hunter. I could feel his eyes boring into my back as I quickened my pace toward the fence that marked the boundaries of our property. "This area's reserved. Get lost." I didn't stop or respond, my pulse hammering in my ears, and then, impossibly, I heard a low chuckle, a sound so sinister it might as well have been a growl. That chuckle echoed in my mind long after it faded into the distance, and with it, a realization began to settle like a weight in my chest. I was in danger far beyond what I'd anticipated. I reached the boundary of our land and felt the familiar relief wash over me, but when I turned back, instinctively looking for trouble, the tree stand seemed impossibly empty. There was no sign of him, it was as if he had melted away into the shadows of the woods. I didn't sleep well that night. Shadows from where my dreams should have been stalked me, wrestling me deeper into a pit of anxiety. The next day I tried to explain to my parents, but they waved my concerns away as the ramblings of a paranoid child. "People are just doing their thing," my father said over breakfast. "You know how the hunters can get." But I had seen something that twisted at the seams of what normal meant. My instincts screamed at me to stay away from the woods, but part of me felt stubbornly drawn back. I needed to confront whatever specter hovered in those trees. The following weekend, I donned my bravest face and headed out again, this time brimming with anger rather than trepidation. Max was at my side once more as we traversed the path, though I felt every heartbeat thrumming through my veins like a war drum. I glanced towards that tree stand, convinced that somehow, impossibly, he was watching me again. "You hear me?" I shouted into the forest, the bravado masking the fear lacing through me. "You can't scare me off my own land." Silence hung, and though my voice rang back at me, I knew I wasn't alone. The shadows felt thicker, and the chill surging through the air seeped right to my bones. It became a twisted game between us. I walked the path, the sense of being hunted curling around me like a predator, watching, waiting. This went on for weeks, each time edging further and further from rationality, caught in the throes of an unnameable dread. Days turned to weeks and the hunter became more than just an encounter. He was a specter, a nightmare made manifest. I would see him in fleeting glimpses through the trees, a flash of camouflage here, a flicker of movement there. The forest became a stage of lurking terror, and one fateful day, with the sun dipping low and shadows elongating, I finally snapped. I took Max and charged across the clearing directly towards the stand, feeling reckless and defiant. "Show yourself," I yelled, hands shaking, ready to face whatever darkness awaited me. Those cold eyes finally met mine from the lofty height above. He emerged, stepping lightly down, and for the first time, I could see his face, gaunt and unshaven, with a smile that didn't look human, a predatory grin laced with a chaotic glint. "Mighty brave of you to come here," he rasped, his voice dripping with a chilling amusement. "You think you have more claim to this land than I do?" Panic exploded in my gut, overwhelming my ability to reason as I took a step backward, but my dog growled, stepping protectively in front of me. I pressed on instinctively wanting to protect him as well. "This is my family's land," I spat, though doubts gnawed at my resolve. "You're nothing but a trespasser." Each word sliced through the air like a knife, but he merely laughed, dark and unrelenting. "I've seen you walking here, dog and all. You think I just go away because you're here? This is my haunt now." The way he said haunt struck a chord deep within. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't turn my back on this monster. "You don't own this place," I rotated, letting anger guide me through fear, "and you're not welcome here." His smile widened, a rictus that hung heavy in the air like some malevolent omen. "You think you can keep me away?" He snarled dangerously, and that puzzle that had haunted me weeks fell into place. This wasn't just about hunting, it was a war over territory, dominance, the very essence of survival. I knew I had to escape, that lingering fear curling around my throat as I found a moment of doubt. He was just a hunter, surely he wouldn't cross any lines? But just then, the echo of footsteps drew near, and I turned to see my parents coming down the path. Relief flooded through me until I saw the confusion in their eyes. "What's going on?" my father called, but the hunter merely cocked his head, an utterly soulless look in his gaze. "This land should have been theirs long ago," he whispered venomously, "but sometimes, the strong take what they want." I felt my breath seize in my throat. I didn't know what I could do. He might have been a man, but he loomed larger than life, a specter of dread that had haunted my every waking moment. "Run!" I shouted at my parents, desperately trying to shield them as panic clawed at my chest, but they were rooted. Fear had snagged them as much as it had ensnared me. "What are you doing?" my mother cried, but that devil's grin sucked the breath from my lungs. I turned to Max, and as if sensing the impending danger, the little dog barked furiously, a fierce protector as he lunged toward the figure that towered over us. And in that instant, I knew, I wasn't the only one he wanted to claim. Everything twisted around me then, screams pierced the stillness as my mind spiraled into chaos, fragmenting like an old, broken mirror, clawing back toward the safety of the woods I had defended in the first place. But what had once felt like refuge now echoed with the sinister knowledge that the hunter would always be hungering for more. As night fell, my parents finally understood, and I was left racing while the woods closed in behind us, a chilling reminder that in this game of survival, sometimes stepping forward meant crossing a line you could never uncross. We might have escaped with our lives, but the terror of that encounter clings to me still, a constant reminder of the haunting truth. Sometimes, it's not just the land that gets claimed, but our very own sanity that follows suit. And every now and then, when the wind howls just right, I can still hear that terrible laughter echoing through the woods, reminding me that I wasn't just trespassing on land but wandering into a realm where the hunter never really stops hunting. AITA for requesting an explanation for my money being spent without my consent? It started with a casual text from my sister, Emma, asking about some weird charges on my bank statement. At first, I thought she was just being paranoid, but that changed when I saw the numbers myself. I had already been on edge ever since I started to notice odd things around my apartment, items misplaced, food disappearing from my fridge, and the eerie sensation that someone was watching me. At first, I brushed it off as stress from my recently taxing job, but as the charges piled up and Emma discovered 4 mysterious withdrawals totaling over $1,000, I began to quake with a fear that flared deep within me. When I confronted Emma, she appeared genuinely concerned, urging me to monitor my accounts, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something foul was lurking underneath. It wasn't just my money at stake but possibly my very security. One night, frayed with the tension, I decided to take action and installed a couple of security cameras around my apartment, small, inconspicuous, and just enough to give me peace of mind. Days passed, and everything seemed normal, until one evening I reviewed the footage and what I saw made my stomach drop, an unknown figure slipping through my back door, their movements too fluid, too practiced. It was a mess of jerky limbs, a shadow that crept between comfort and chaos. My heart raced as I flipped through the clips, finding evidence of this intrusion every night, a routine that felt like a sinister ballet played out on my own floor. I found myself losing sleep over the thought of this uninvited guest, replaying the footage over and over until I began to recognize patterns. He'd always visit around 2 a.m., rifling through my belongings, sometimes even holding my credit card, his face obscured by a cheap mask, but his hands, oh God, those hands, were skeletal, fingers darting like spiders, and it chilled my blood to watch him swipe my card for groceries, for God knows what with my hard-earned cash. I decided I had to do something drastic. Gathering my courage, I called a private investigator who specialized in cases of stalking and theft. After explaining my situation, he seemed just as perplexed, yet assured me he'd find the truth. He assured me I was not alone in this battle, and with my permission, he installed discreet cameras and started monitoring the situation. The next evening, I was jolted from sleep by a loud creak, the unmistakable sound of my back door swinging open. Heart pounding, I turned on the monitor to see the masked figure once more, but this time he wasn't alone. Standing beside him was another figure, a woman in a flowing white dress, her long hair cascading in waves that concealed her face. They were conversing, low murmurs spilling into the silent night, and for a moment, I could have sworn one of them gestured towards my camera. Was this all just a sick prank? Suddenly, the two turned, and I could see the woman reach out, trailing her fingers over the edge of a knife she pulled from her waistband before wrapping her hand around the figure's wrist. Something deep in my gut warned me that they were no ordinary thieves. This was a premeditated act, some grotesque performance playing out in my living room. I felt paralyzed, half wishing to flee while simultaneously entranced by the surreal nature of it all. Just then, the woman looked directly into the camera and I swear she smiled, a wide, toothy grin that shattered my nerves into a million pieces. The following days descended into pure madness. I began receiving letters slipped under my door, the kind of letters that feel like a taunt from an unseen adversary. They spoke in riddles and whispered of my past, old secrets I thought I had buried alive, tales of debts I never acknowledged, family issues long resolved, and a chilling prophecy about how my curiosity would be my undoing. Night after night, I received strange deliveries, packages filled with personal items from my childhood, acquired during those hellish break-ins but intended for some twisted purpose only they understood. Then everything came crashing down on an ordinary Thursday evening when I received a chilling text from Emma. "I think they know about us," it read, accompanied by a picture of her home, the same woman from my video standing just outside her window, a finger pressed to her lips, as if to silence her. Panic surged through my body, and I dialed her number, begging to know if she was okay, but when she answered, her voice carried a tremor. "They came to my house, Jamie, asking about you. They said you were supposed to pay the price." Tears streamed down my face, clutching at my phone as she continued, "They told me to tell you to stop investigating or else." The call ended abruptly. I stood in my kitchen, staring blankly at the wall, dread choking me. After that, my world spiraled rapidly into an abyss of paranoia. Every sound morphed into a threat, shadows danced menacingly at the corners of my vision, and the silence was punctuated by an awareness I wished I could escape. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't breathe, trapped in an existential maze of horror. One fateful night, I mustered the courage to confront the twisted reality of my life. I figured if they wanted me, I'd meet them on my terms. I set up a final trap, luring them in with the results of my mounting searches, fake articles about how to win the lottery and the secret to eternal youth. I awoke just past midnight to the unmistakable sound of shuffling by my window. I could barely breathe as I crawled toward the security camera, heart racing, praying one final act would unveil the truth behind all of this. They slipped inside, the woman's laugh cutting through the insistent quiet as she plucked treasures from my drawers, memories, trinkets, possessions that were once dear to me. And then she turned, the mask slipping off her head to expose a face I knew all too well, my own twisted grin reflected in a funhouse mirror, stripped of its humanity. And there, standing beside her, was the very figure I had panicked over, his presence dark and foreboding. I realized, in that heart-stopping moment, that they were me, manifestations of every sin I'd ever committed rising to envelop me, whispering sweet promises of freedom if only I would embrace the chaos. At that moment, my fate lay in their hands, their hollow words chilling me to the bone as they reminded me, "You always wanted to know. I need to share something that happened to me recently, and let me tell you, it's been haunting me ever since." I, 24, male, was living with my roommate, Sarah, 22, female, in an apartment that came with limited parking spaces, so we both had a parking pass we needed to display to keep our vehicles safe from being towed. Now, at first, everything seemed fine, but it didn't take long for Sarah's behavior to change. Picture this, every night she'd come home late, sometimes after midnight, after what she said were long shifts at her second job, which I didn't mind until I started noticing that she was leaving her car parked without the pass displayed, even though I'd reminded her at least a dozen times. The first time I noticed it, I told her to park in our designated spot and put the pass up. She waved me off, claiming she would handle it, but as weeks turned into months, the same pattern played out. Her car would sit there, vulnerable and ominously unchecked. I think deep down I knew that ignoring the rules and parking without a pass was what made her feel rebellious, but the threat of a tow loomed over both our heads, and I started to get anxious every time I saw her vehicle in its usual spot without the pass, yet when I confronted her, she'd brush me off like I was the unreasonable one. It escalated the night I saw a tow truck pulling into the lot. It was like watching a slow-motion train wreck. I could see the driver scanning for offenders, and a chill ran down my spine as I stepped into the hallway. I had a choice to make. I won't lie, I mentally calculated the consequences for both of us, lose her car or confront her again, but knowing Sarah, I could picture her obnoxious eye rolling every time I brought it up, so in that moment, I made the decision. I followed that tow truck. Through the glass door, I watched as they got out and approached her car. My heart raced as I jogged down the stairs, desperate to stop them, but it was already too late. They had it lifted off the ground, and in that moment, I felt a pitiful mix of satisfaction and impending regret. I'd done what I thought was right, but the backlash I anticipated didn't take long to arrive. The next morning, I woke up to find Sarah standing over me, her face pale with anger, and she wasted no time accusing me of being the sole reason her car was gone. I tried to explain how many times I had warned her, how this was purely a consequence of her choices, but she kept accusing me of sabotaging her life and ruining her independence. She even went as far as saying I was taking pleasure in her misfortune. I told her that if she had just followed the rules, we wouldn't be here. That evening, her attempts at getting her car back only compounded her frustration when she learned that her parking pass had been revoked as well. In her fury, she vowed to make my life miserable, and I didn't take her seriously until the creepy stuff started happening. She'd come home late and drop heavy items on the floor to wake me up, blasting music with absurdly loud bass to keep me from sleeping, and I'd find my refrigerator contents rearranged or the dishes dirty when I'd cleaned them just the day before. I thought I was being paranoid until one night, while I was curled up trying to block out the noise with my headphones, I heard her whispering outside my door, saying my name in this eerie sing-song voice that sent chills through my spine. It was as if she was summoning something sinister. I confronted her about it, but she just laughed, saying she was testing my sanity. That was when I began noticing odd occurrences. One of my PS4 games went missing, only to later appear in her room, and when I asked her what it was doing there, she merely shrugged and claimed it found its way. Friends on social media started checking in on me, asking why I looked so tired all the time, and I eventually began sleeping at a friend's house after noticing that she would watch me while I slept, her eyes glimmering strangely in the darkness. I figured I would come clean to anyone that would listen about the awful situation, but my friends thought I was the weird one. I felt isolated, trapped in an apartment that now seemed haunted by her twisted perspective. The turning point came weeks later when I found out that an old mutual friend of ours went missing after reaching out to Sarah, claiming they needed to talk. I immediately tried to talk to her about it, but she just dismissed my concerns, telling me it had nothing to do with her. It was then, in a panic, I decided to check her texts and discovered that she had sent cryptic messages about someone transcending and being free along with a strange timestamp that mirrored the night my friend disappeared. My gut told me something sinister had happened, but the moment she caught me snooping, it was like unleashing Pandora's box. The next day, I woke up to find my belongings trashed. Somehow she snuck in during the night, and I panicked. I grabbed my phone to call the police, but the battery was dead. My heart thudded in my chest as I realized it was only a matter of time before she would come back, and based on what I saw in her texts, I knew I had to escape before my life turned into a living nightmare. The following night, I snuck out, clutching a single duffel bag, but when I reached the parking lot, I was greeted by the harrowing sight of her car parked, with the driver's seat illuminated, even though this time she was nowhere to be seen. I hesitated, but the only way I knew I could protect myself was to leave, so I bolted to my car, only to be peppered by a deafening laughter echoing back from the direction of the apartment. Never have I felt terror like that, knotting through my stomach as I drove through the night, and even now, weeks later, I keep looking over my shoulder, paranoid that she followed me or that somehow, I've let something dark linger, but I still wonder if I went too far by getting her car towed, regardless of whatever captivating madness her psyche had devolved into, and the looming question remains, was I the villain in this twisted tale, or just a victim entangled in a nightmare?